On the morning of January 4th, 1903, a crowd of 1,500 people gathered on the cold grey sand of Coney Island to watch an elephant die. They stood in their Sunday coats, breath rising in white plumes, children lifted onto shoulders for a better view. Vendors moved through the crowd selling roasted peanuts. Someone had brought a camera crew. The elephant's name was Topsy, and she had killed 3 men. Though the truth of that claim, like so much else in this story, was more complicated than the newspapers made it seem. What the crowd did not know, what almost no one watching that morning could have understood, was that they were witnessing the final act of a war that had been waged for more than a decade. Not a war of nations or armies, but a war of currents, a war of ideas, a war fought with copper wire and public spectacle, and the carefully staged deaths of living creatures. The elephant standing on that wooden platform, copper sandals fitted to her feet, was not simply an animal being put down for public safety. She was a piece of evidence in an argument, a demonstration meant to prove a point that the man who arranged it had been trying to prove for 15 years. And that man, the most famous inventor in the world, the Wizard of Menlo Park, the name that had become synonymous with American genius itself, was not present that morning. He did not need to be. He had already done his work. He had already made his case in 100 smaller demonstrations, in 1,000 newspaper interviews, in the deaths of dogs and cats and horses, and most notoriously, in the design of a new kind of death that the state of New York had adopted 6 years earlier. By the time Topsy stood on that platform, waiting for the current to pass through her body, Thomas Alva Edison had already built a machine for killing, and he had built it specifically because he believed that the only way to win his war was to make his enemy's invention a synonym for death. But that is not what the newspapers said. That is not what the history books would remember. And that gap between what happened and what was recorded, between what Edison did and what Edison meant, is the heart of the story we are going to tell tonight. So settle in. This is a long story, and parts of it are difficult to hear. But it is also a story about how history gets made, how legends get built, and how the things we choose to remember are often the things that someone long ago worked very hard to make sure we would forget. We're going to take it slowly, piece by piece, all the way back to the beginning, and we have all the time in the world. To understand what happened on Coney Island that cold January morning, you have to go back nearly 20 years, to a time when the world was darker in the most literal sense. In 1880, the average American city after sunset was a place of shadows. Streets were lit where they were lit at all, by gas lamps that threw pools of yellow light surrounded by vast territories of black. Houses were lit by candles or oil lamps, flames that flickered and smoked and had to be carefully tended. The darkness was not a metaphor. It was a physical fact of life that shaped everything, from when people slept to how far they could safely travel, to what they could see of each other's faces after the sun went down. And then, in the span of a single decade, everything changed. The man who changed it was Thomas Edison, and by 1880 he was already the most celebrated inventor in America. He had given the world the phonograph, a machine that could capture and replay the human voice, something so miraculous that when he first demonstrated it, grown men wept. He had improved the telegraph, the stock ticker, the telephone. He had built a laboratory in Menlo Park, New Jersey, that operated unlike anything the world had seen before, a factory for invention itself, staffed by dozens of engineers and craftsmen who worked under Edison's direction to solve problems that had stymied everyone else. But the thing Edison wanted most, the prize he had set his sights on, was light. Not the flickering, dangerous, expensive light of gas and oil, but steady, safe, electric light. Light that could be turned on and off with the flip of a switch. Light that would never need to be trimmed or refilled. Light that would transform the night into something almost like day. Others had tried. Others had come close. Arc lights, which worked by passing current between 2 carbon electrodes, were already being used in some factories and public spaces. But arc lights were brutal things, blindingly bright, prone to sparking and sputtering, far too intense for domestic use. What Edison wanted was an incandescent bulb, a sealed glass container with a filament inside that would glow steadily when electricity passed through it. The concept was simple. The execution was ferociously difficult. The filament was the problem. It had to glow brightly enough to be useful, but it could not burn out. It had to resist heat, resist oxidation, resist the very forces that made it glow in the first place. Edison and his team tested thousands of materials: platinum, carbon, bamboo fiber, thread, hair, paper. They worked through the nights, month after month, failure after failure, until finally, in October of 1879, they found a carbonized bamboo filament that burned for over 1,200 hours. The incandescent light bulb was born, and the world, quite literally, would never be dark again in the same way. But a light bulb without electricity is just a glass ornament. And this is where the story begins to turn, because Edison understood something that many inventors before him had not. He understood that he was not selling a product. He was building a system. The bulb was useless without current. Current was useless without wires to carry it. Wires were useless without a generator to create the electricity in the first place. What Edison was proposing was not a lamp. It was an entire infrastructure, a network that would have to be built from the ground up, every piece designed to work with every other piece, all of it flowing from Edison's patents, Edison's factories, Edison's vision. He built the first commercial power station on Pearl Street in Lower Manhattan, and when it switched on in September of 1882, it was serving 85 customers with 400 light bulbs. Within a year, it was serving over 500. Within a few years, Edison's system was spreading across America and Europe, and the man himself had become a symbol of something larger than any single invention. He was progress itself, the future made flesh, the proof that American ingenuity could reshape the world. And the current that flowed through those wires, the current that powered those bulbs, was direct current. DC electricity that moved in one direction only, steady and unchanging from the generator to the bulb and back again. This mattered. This mattered more than almost anyone realized at the time, because direct current had a fundamental limitation, a physical constraint that no amount of genius could overcome. Direct current does not travel well. It loses strength over distance, bleeding away into the resistance of the wires themselves. The farther you try to send it, the weaker it gets. This meant that Edison's power stations could only serve customers within a mile or so of the generator. Every neighborhood that wanted electric light would need its own power station. Every city would need dozens, maybe hundreds. The infrastructure would be vast, redundant, expensive, a generator on every block, wires tangled overhead like the web of some enormous mechanical spider. Edison knew this, his investors knew this, but the system worked, and it was making money, and for a few years it seemed as though the limitations of direct current were simply the price of progress, an engineering problem that would be solved in time, or that would prove not to matter as much as the skeptics claimed. And then a young man from Serbia arrived in New York with 4 cents in his pocket and a letter of introduction to Thomas Edison, and the war of currents began. His name was Nikola Tesla, and he had been thinking about electricity since he was a child in the village of Smiljan, in what was then the Austrian Empire. He had seen his first electrical demonstration at the age of 3, when he stroked a cat's fur and watched the sparks fly in the darkness. He had grown up obsessed with the invisible forces that moved through the world, the hidden currents that connected everything to everything else. By the time he was a young man studying engineering in Austria, he had become convinced that direct current was a dead end, a technology that would eventually be replaced by something far more elegant and far more powerful. Alternating current, a sea electricity that did not flow in one direction only, but oscillated back and forth, reversing itself dozens of times per second, pulsing through the wires like the beating of a heart. The advantage of alternating current was almost absurdly simple once you understood it. Because the current changed direction, it could be transformed. Step it up to very high voltages for transmission over long distances, then step it down again at the destination for safe use in homes and factories. A single power plant could serve an entire city, an entire region, without losing significant power to the wires. The infrastructure would be simpler, cheaper, vastly more efficient. Tesla saw this. Tesla believed in this with the fervour of a prophet. And in 1884, he came to America to work for the one man he believed could help him build it. For a time, Tesla worked in Edison's laboratory. The accounts of their relationship vary, coloured by the decades of rivalry that followed. Some say Edison dismissed Tesla as an impractical dreamer. Some say Tesla was promised a bonus that Edison never paid. What is certain is that the two men were profoundly different in temperament and method. Edison was the tireless experimenter, the man who tested thousands of filaments until he found one that worked, who believed that genius was 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. Tesla was the visionary, the man who could design a machine entirely in his mind, rotating it, testing it, refining it without ever building a physical prototype. Within a year, Tesla left Edison's employ. He spent the next several years in relative obscurity, digging ditches for a time, struggling to find investors who believed in his ideas. And then, in 1888, he found George Westinghouse. Westinghouse was a different kind of industrialist. He had made his fortune in railroad air brakes, and he understood systems thinking, the way that individual components had to work together to create something larger than the sum of their parts. He saw immediately what alternating current could do. He bought Tesla's patents. He began building AC power stations. And within a few years, he was directly challenging Edison for control of the American electrical industry. This was the moment when the war of currents became a war in the truest sense. Because Edison understood what was at stake. He had built his empire on direct current. His patents, his factories, his reputation, his fortune, all of it depended on DC remaining the standard. If alternating current won, if the world adopted Tesla and Westinghouse's system, Edison would not simply lose market share, he would lose everything, and so he began to fight. Not with better engineering, not with improved technology, not by solving the fundamental limitations of direct current. He began to fight with fear. The campaign started quietly, in pamphlets and newspaper interviews and letters to municipal governments. Edison began warning anyone who would listen that alternating current was dangerous. He pointed to the higher voltages that AC systems used for transmission. He talked about the invisible death that ran through the wires. He used a word that would become his weapon, a word that would eventually be applied to the execution of a condemned man, and years later, to the death of an elephant on Coney Island. The word was electrocution. In 1887, Edison hired a man named Harold Brown to conduct a series of demonstrations. Brown was not officially an Edison employee. That was important, because it allowed Edison to maintain a distance from what was about to happen, to claim that the demonstrations were independent scientific inquiries rather than corporate propaganda. But Brown worked out of Edison's laboratory. He used Edison's equipment, and the purpose of his demonstrations was unmistakably clear. Brown began killing animals with electricity. The first victims were dogs. Brown would stand before crowds of journalists and electrical experts, a stray dog strapped to a metal plate, and he would demonstrate the difference between direct current and alternating current. He would apply DC to the animal, and the dog would yelp and struggle but survive. Then he would apply AC at the same voltage, and the dog would die. The conclusion was obvious, or at least Brown wanted it to be obvious. Alternating current was a killer. Direct current was safe. The demonstrations continued for months. Dogs gave way to larger animals, calves, horses. Each death was carefully documented, carefully described in the press. Brown travelled to different cities, performing his experiments before different audiences, always with the same result. The AC kills, the DC does not. This is not opinion. This is science. This is proof. What Brown did not tell his audiences, what Edison certainly knew but chose not to mention, was that the demonstrations were rigged. The direct current was applied at relatively low voltages, well within the range that an animal could survive. The alternating current was applied at much higher voltages, levels that would have been lethal regardless of what kind of current was used. It was not a fair comparison. It was not meant to be a fair comparison. It was theatre dressed up as science, fear dressed up as fact. But the newspapers printed what Brown told them. The public began to associate alternating current with death, and Edison, watching from his laboratory, must have believed that he was winning. Then came the electric chair. In the late 1880s, the state of New York was looking for a more humane method of execution. Hanging had fallen out of favour, seen as barbaric and unreliable, prone to botched jobs that left the condemned man strangling for minutes. A commission was formed to study alternatives, and Harold Brown, flush with his success in killing dogs and horses, saw an opportunity. Brown proposed an electric chair. He proposed, specifically, an electric chair that used alternating current. The logic was almost elegant in its perversity. If the state of New York adopted AC for executions, it would permanently associate Westinghouse's technology with death. Every time a prisoner was electrocuted, every time the newspapers reported on an execution, The public would be reminded that alternating current was the current of the condemned, the current of the death house, the current that killed. Edison supported the proposal. He supported it publicly. He supported it privately. He supported it in ways that would only become clear years later when his correspondence was examined by historians. He lent his laboratory for experiments. He provided technical advice. And when Brown needed to acquire a Westinghouse generator for the first execution, because the chair had to use Westinghouse equipment, had to be visibly and undeniably associated with Westinghouse's system, Edison's people helped arrange the purchase through intermediaries, hiding the true purpose of the acquisition. The first man to die in the electric chair was William Kemmler, a vegetable peddler from Buffalo who had murdered his common-law wife with a hatchet. The execution took place on August 6, 1890 at Auburn Prison. It did not go well. Kemmler was strapped into the chair, electrodes attached to his head and spine. The current was applied for 17 seconds. When it stopped, Kemmler was still breathing. His body had convulsed, smoke had risen from the electrodes, the smell of burning flesh filled the room, but he was not dead. The executioner applied the current again for over a minute this time, until the witnesses in the room were physically ill, until one of them shouted that they were witnessing something worse than a hanging. Kemmler's body caught fire before he died. George Westinghouse, when he heard what had happened, said they would have done better using an axe, but Edison had achieved his goal. The newspapers reported the horror of the electric chair in gruesome detail. They reported that it had been powered by alternating current, by Westinghouse's system, by the same electricity that Westinghouse wanted to bring into American homes. The word that Edison had been using for years now had a concrete meaning, a face, a body still smoking in a prison death chamber. Electrocution. That was what alternating current did. That was what alternating current was for. And yet, despite everything, despite the dead dogs and the burning body of William Kemmler, Edison was losing the war. The problem was simple. The problem was physics. No matter how much fear Edison generated, no matter how many animals Harold Brown killed, no matter how many prisoners died in the electric chair, alternating current remained vastly superior for power transmission. Westinghouse continued to build power plants. Tesla continued to refine his designs. And in 1893, alternating current won the contract to light the world's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, the great world's fair that would showcase American progress to the entire planet. The fair was a triumph. The White City, they called it. A dreamscape of neoclassical buildings bathed in electric light. 200,000 incandescent bulbs powered by 12 generators, all of them running on alternating current. Millions of visitors walked through the grounds and saw the future, and the future was AC. That same year, Westinghouse won the contract to build a power plant at Niagara Falls, a project that would generate electricity from the falls themselves and transmit it to Buffalo, 26 miles away. Direct current could never have made that journey. Alternating current made it effortlessly. By the mid-1890s, the war of currents was effectively over. Alternating current had won. Tesla's vision, Westinghouse's investment, the elegant physics of the transformer and the rotating magnetic field, all of it had proven more powerful than Edison's fear campaign. The infrastructure of the 20th century would be built on AC. Edison's direct current systems would be gradually phased out, relegated to specific applications where their limitations did not matter. Edison himself eventually accepted defeat, though he never acknowledged it publicly, never admitted that he had been wrong, never apologized for the animals that had died or the terror he had deliberately cultivated. He turned his attention to other projects, other inventions, other ways of shaping the world. The phonograph, motion pictures, the cement house. He remained famous, remained celebrated, remained the Wizard of Menlo Park in the public imagination. The darker chapters of the current wars faded into footnotes, mentioned briefly if at all, embarrassments best forgotten, but the killing did not stop. On Coney Island, in the years around the turn of the century, there was a place called Luna Park. It was one of the great amusement parks of its age, a fantasia of towers and minarets and electric lights, a place where the working people of New York could escape for a day into a world of spectacle and wonder. And Luna Park had elephants. Topsy had come to Luna Park from the Four Paw Circus. She was an Asian elephant, about 28 years old, and she had spent her entire life in captivity, performing tricks, carrying riders, doing the things that captive elephants were made to do. The records say she'd killed 3 men, though when you look closely at the records, the truth becomes more complicated. One of the deaths may have been self-defense, provocation by a handler. Another may have been an accident. The details are murky, buried under decades of sensationalist newspaper coverage that was more interested in the story of a killer elephant than in the question of what had been done to make her that way. What is certain is that by 1902, Topsy was considered unmanageable. She was erratic, she was dangerous, she could not be controlled. And the owners of Luna Park, whether out of genuine concern for safety or out of a desire for one final spectacle, decided that she had to be put down. The method at first was going to be hanging. This was not unusual. Animals that had killed humans were sometimes executed publicly, a kind of legal theatre that satisfied the public's desire for justice, or what passed for justice when the accused could not speak in her own defence. But the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals objected. Hanging an elephant was cruel, they said. It would cause unnecessary suffering. There had to be a better way. And so, in the final weeks of 1902, the owners of Luna Park began looking for alternatives. They considered poison. They considered shooting. And then someone, it is unclear exactly who, suggested electricity. The connection to Edison was not accidental. By this time, the electric companies had significant interest in Coney Island. The infrastructure was in place, the expertise was available, and the idea of electrocuting the elephant fit into a longer history, a history that Edison himself had written, of using electrical death as a public demonstration. The newspapers would cover it. The crowds would come. And even though the war of currents was over, even though alternating current had won, the spectacle of an elephant dying by electricity would still carry a certain message, still evoke a certain fear, still remind the public that electricity was dangerous, that the current that ran through the wires of their homes was the same current that could stop a heart. Edison sent a film crew. This detail matters. By 1903, Edison was deeply invested in motion pictures, and his company was producing short films for the new Nickelodeons that were spreading across America. A film of an elephant being electrocuted would be something unprecedented, something that would draw crowds and sell tickets. It was not enough for Topsy to die. Her death had to be captured, preserved, reproduced endlessly, watched by audiences who had not been present on that cold January morning. So let us return to Coney Island, to the grey sand and the winter sky, and the 1,500 people waiting in their coats. Let us return to Topsy standing on the wooden platform, the copper sandals on her feet, the electrodes ready to deliver 6,600 volts of alternating current through her body. The cameras were rolling, the operators were ready at their switches, and Topsy, who had spent nearly 3 decades doing what she was told, stood quietly, waiting for whatever was about to happen. There are things we do not know about that morning. We do not know if Topsy understood what the crowd had come to see. We do not know if she was afraid, though elephants are intelligent animals, social animals, animals capable of recognizing death and mourning their dead. We do not know what she was thinking in those final moments, if thinking is even the right word for the interior life of an elephant. What we know is what the film shows. We know that when the current was applied, Topsy stiffened and fell. We know that smoke rose from her body. We know that within 10 seconds she was dead, her massive frame lying still on the platform while the crowd watched and the cameras recorded, and somewhere, in a laboratory or a mansion or a quiet room where he read the newspapers, Thomas Edison received word that the demonstration had been a success. The film survives. It is 64 seconds long. You can still watch it today if you have the stomach for it. This grainy record of a death that happened over a century ago. Edison's company distributed it under the title Electrocuting an Elephant. It played in Nickelodeons across America. People paid their nickels to watch Topsy die, again and again, as many times as they wanted. And this is where we must pause and ask a question that has no simple answer. What does it mean that the most celebrated inventor of the 19th century, the man who brought light to the world, the symbol of American progress and ingenuity, built his legend partly on the systematic killing of animals? What does it mean that he filmed those killings and sold them as entertainment? What does it mean that the same man who gave us the phonograph and the motion picture camera also gave us the electric chair, gave us the spectacle of dogs writhing on metal plates, gave us the image of an elephant falling in a cloud of smoke? It means, perhaps, that progress is never as clean as the legends suggest. It means that the line between genius and cruelty is not always clear, that the same mind capable of imagining a world transformed by light could also imagine a campaign of fear built on death. It means that when we tell the story of how the modern world was built, we have to include not just the triumphs but the costs, not just the inventions but the suffering they required. But it also means something else, something that may be harder to accept. It means that Edison, for all his brilliance, was afraid. The War of Currents was not just a business competition. It was an existential threat to everything Edison had built, everything he had staked his name and his fortune on. And when he faced that threat, he did not respond with better engineering or deeper innovation. He responded with terror. He tried to make the world afraid of his enemy's invention, and when that failed, when alternating current won anyway, he kept killing animals because the killing had become its own kind of logic, its own kind of proof. Topsy was not the first animal to die in Edison's war, and she was not the last. But she was the largest, and she was the most public, and her death was captured on film in a way that none of the others had been. She became, in a sense, the monument to a campaign that Edison himself would have preferred to forget. The evidence that would not disappear, the 64 seconds of footage that would surface again and again in the decades to come, each time the question was asked about what the Wizard of Menlo Park had really done in the years when the world was choosing how to light itself. The film is grainy, the image flickers, but the elephant falls, and the smoke rises, and somewhere in that moment, frozen now in silver nitrate, is everything we need to know about the distance between what history remembers and what history was. And yet the story does not end with Topsy's death. It does not end with the smoke rising from her body, or the cameras clicking shut, or the crowd dispersing into the cold January air of Coney Island. Because the War of Currents, by the time that elephant fell, had already been decided. Edison had already lost. To understand how completely he had lost, and what that loss reveals about the nature of the campaign he had waged, we have to go back a few years, to a time when the outcome was still uncertain, when the battle lines were still being drawn across the landscape of American industry and American fear. The year was 1893. The place was Chicago, and the occasion was the World's Columbian Exposition, one of the largest gatherings of human achievement the world had ever seen. 27 million people would pass through its gates over the course of 6 months. They would see marvels they had never imagined, technologies that seemed to belong to some impossible future, visions of what the 20th century might become. And at the centre of it all, lighting the entire fairground with a radiance that made visitors gasp and weep and fall to their knees in something like prayer, was alternating current. George Westinghouse had won the contract to illuminate the fair. It was the largest electrical installation in history, and he had underbid Edison by nearly $1 million. The fair required more electricity than the entire city of Chicago used at the time, and Westinghouse delivered it flawlessly, using generators and transformers designed in collaboration with Nikola Tesla, the man whose patents had made the whole thing possible. The White City, they called it, because the buildings were painted a luminous white, and the electric lights made them glow like something from a dream. Visitors who had never seen electric light before walked through those grounds at night and felt that they were witnessing the birth of a new world, and they were right. They were witnessing the moment when alternating current proved beyond any reasonable doubt that it could do everything Edison's direct current could do at a fraction of the cost, over distances that Edison's system could never hope to reach. Edison was not at the fair. He had been invited, of course. His name was still synonymous with electricity, still the first name that came to mind when Americans thought of invention and progress. But he did not attend the celebration of his rival's triumph. He stayed away, and the fair glowed without him, and the world changed while he was not watching. This is what the killing of animals had been meant to prevent. This is what all the demonstrations, all the electrocuted dogs, all the letters to newspapers, all the whispered campaigns had been designed to stop. Edison had tried to make the world believe that alternating current was too dangerous to use, that it would kill anyone who came near it, that it was a technology of death rather than of progress. And for a time, some people had believed him. For a time, the fear had seemed to be working. But fear, it turns out, is a limited currency. You can spend it only so many times before it loses its value, and the more Edison spent it, the more people began to notice what he was not doing. He was not building better systems. He was not finding ways to make direct current travel farther or cost less. He was not innovating. He was only frightening, only warning, only killing. And eventually, the world grew tired of being frightened and decided to look instead at what actually worked. Alternating current worked. It worked spectacularly. The Chicago Fair proved it to 27 million witnesses, and after that, the debate was effectively over. Cities that had been hesitant began to switch. Power companies that had invested in Edison's system began to convert. The great transmission lines that would eventually span the continent, carrying electricity from distant power plants to homes and factories hundreds of miles away, would all carry alternating current because there was simply no other way to do it. Edison's direct current would survive in small pockets, in certain subway systems and elevator networks, and specialized industrial applications, but as a vision of the electrical future it was finished, and yet Edison kept killing. This is perhaps the strangest part of the story, the part that resists easy explanation. By the time Topsy died in 1903, the war of currents had been over for nearly a decade. Alternating current had won so completely that arguing against it was like arguing against the sunrise. The Niagara Falls Power Project, which went online in 1896, had demonstrated that alternating current could harness one of the greatest natural forces on the planet and transmit its power to cities more than 20 miles away. The entire electrical infrastructure of the modern world was being built on Westinghouse's system, on Tesla's patents, on the very technology that Edison had spent years trying to destroy. So why did Topsy have to die? Why, in 1903, was Edison's company still involved in public demonstrations of electrical death? The answer, if there is one, lies somewhere in the nature of campaigns that outlive their purpose, in the momentum of violence once it has been set in motion. Edison had built an apparatus for killing and an argument for why the killing mattered, and even after the argument had been refuted, the apparatus remained. The techniques had been perfected, the relationships had been established. The logic of demonstration, of spectacle, of public fear had become its own self-sustaining engine. And there was perhaps another factor, one that is harder to measure but impossible to ignore. Edison had staked his reputation on being right. He had told the world that alternating current was a killer, that it would electrocute linemen and burn down houses and turn every electrical wire into a potential instrument of death. He had testified before legislatures. He had written to newspapers. He had sent his agents to communities across the country to spread the warning. And he had been wrong. For a man who prided himself on being right, on seeing farther and understanding more deeply than anyone else, this was not an easy thing to accept. The evidence was all around him, in every city that switched to alternating current without disaster, in every power line that carried Tesla's frequencies without killing anyone, in the simple, stubborn fact that the technology he had called deadly was quietly and effectively lighting the world. But Edison did not adjust his position. He did not acknowledge that his fears had been exaggerated or his campaign misguided. He simply kept doing what he'd been doing, kept killing animals, kept filming the deaths, kept distributing the footage, as if repetition alone could restore the truth of a claim that the world had stopped believing. Topsy, in this sense, was not a strategic act. She was not killed to influence a decision that had not yet been made. She was killed because the killing had become habitual, because the men who knew how to do it kept being asked to do it, because there were still audiences who would pay to watch, and promoters who would pay to stage it, and newspapers that would still report on the spectacle of an elephant being electrocuted in public. She was killed because the war was over, but the warriors had not gone home, and she was killed because in the end no one with the power to stop it decided that it was wrong. This is where the story becomes something larger than a tale of business competition or technological rivalry. This is where it becomes a story about what human beings are willing to witness, what we're willing to call entertainment, what we're willing to accept as the price of progress. Because Topsy was not killed in secret. She was killed in front of 1,500 people who had come specifically to watch her die. She was killed by men who announced in advance what they were going to do and invited the public to attend. She was killed, and then the film of her killing was distributed to theatres across the country, where audiences paid to see it again and again. What does it mean that thousands of people wanted to watch this? What does it mean that the death of an elephant was considered an appropriate form of public amusement, a suitable way to spend an afternoon, a thing you might do for fun on a day when you had nothing better planned? Part of the answer lies in the attitudes of the era. Animals in 1903 occupied a different place in the moral universe than they do today. They were property, resources, tools. The idea that an elephant might have an inner life worth considering, that her fear might be a thing that mattered, that her death might be a wrong rather than simply an event, was not yet part of mainstream thought. The crowds who gathered to watch Topsy die were not, by the standards of their time, doing anything unusual or shameful. They were attending a spectacle, much as they might attend a boxing match or a public execution, and the spectacle happened to involve an animal, and the animal happened to die, and that was simply how things were. But part of the answer lies somewhere else, somewhere darker and more enduring. Human beings have always been drawn to death. We have always gathered to watch the gladiator fall, the criminal hang, the animal bleed. There is something in us that wants to see the moment when life ends, that is fascinated by the boundary between being and not being, that cannot look away from the spectacle of mortality made visible. This impulse did not begin in 1903, and it did not end there. It is still with us today, in the videos that go viral because they show something terrible happening, in the traffic that slows to gape at accidents, in the hunger for images of disaster and violence that drives so much of what we consume. Topsy died because Edison's campaign had created a market for electrical death, and her handlers wanted money, and the promoters wanted a crowd, and the crowd wanted to see something they had never seen before. She died because all the pieces were in place, all the incentives aligned, all the forces that might have stopped it were either absent or indifferent. She died because no one in that chain of decisions asked whether it was right, only whether it was possible, and the film remains. This is the thing that separates Topsy's death from the deaths of all the dogs and horses and cattle that came before her. Those animals died and were forgotten, their suffering recorded only in newspaper accounts and technical documents, but Topsy was filmed. Her 64 seconds of dying were preserved on a strip of celluloid that would outlast everyone who watched her fall, everyone who operated the cameras, everyone who bought tickets to the Nickelodeons where the footage played. Edison had pioneered the motion picture. He had invented the kinetoscope, built the first film studio, created the technology that would eventually become Hollywood and the entire global industry of cinema. And one of the early uses of that technology, one of the things that Edison's cameras captured for posterity, was an elephant being electrocuted for the entertainment of a crowd. The same impulse that drove him to record the world, to preserve moments in time so that future generations could see them, also drove him to record a death. And because he recorded it, we can still see it today, more than a century later, this grainy image of smoke and collapse, this document of what human beings once considered acceptable. The film has become, in a way, a kind of judgment. It does not go away. It cannot be explained or contextualized into harmlessness. Every few years, someone discovers it again, and the story of Topsy is retold, and the question is asked again about what Edison was really doing and why. The film makes the question unavoidable. It makes the death present, immediate, impossible to dismiss as ancient history. It forces us to look at what was done in the name of progress and ask whether progress was worth this price. And it forces us to look at ourselves, at what we are still willing to watch, at what we are still willing to accept. Because the impulses that filled the stands at Coney Island on that January afternoon have not disappeared. They have only changed form. The crowds that gathered to watch an elephant die are no different, in their fundamental nature, from the audiences that consume violence and suffering through their screens today. The technology has improved, as the spectacles have multiplied, but the human appetite for witnessing death, for being present at the moment when something alive becomes something that is not, remains as strong as it ever was. Topsy's death, in this sense, is not just a historical curiosity, it is a mirror. It shows us something about who we were, and in showing us that, it asks us who we have become. The smoke rose from her body. The cameras captured the moment. The film was distributed, watched, forgotten, rediscovered. And the question that the footage poses has never really been answered. What does it mean to build the future on the suffering of those who cannot refuse to participate? What does it mean to call something progress when its cost is measured in lives? What does it mean to record an act of cruelty and sell it as entertainment? These are the questions that Topsy left behind. These are the questions that the War of Currents, for all its technological significance, ultimately became about. Not which system was better, not whose patents would prevail, not who would make more money or control more markets, but what we are willing to do to each other and to the creatures around us in the pursuit of our ambitions. Edison did not invent cruelty. He did not create the human fascination with death or the willingness to treat animals as expendable resources, but he harnessed those impulses. He organized them. He turned them into a strategy, a campaign, a business model. And in doing so, he revealed something about the nature of invention itself, about the relationship between creativity and destruction, about the darkness that can live alongside the light in even the most brilliant minds. The electric chair was his creation, or at least it bore his fingerprints. He had advocated for it, helped design it, insisted that it use alternating current so that his rival's technology would forever be associated with death. The first man to die in the electric chair, William Kemmler, died badly. The execution was botched, the current was applied, and Kemmler convulsed, and the executioners thought he was dead, but he was not dead. He was still breathing, still twitching, still somehow alive despite the thousands of volts that had passed through his body. They had to shock him again. The witnesses reported the smell of burning flesh. One of them vomited. A reporter wrote that it would have been more humane to use an axe. This was the technology that Edison had helped create. This was the death he had advocated for. The method he had insisted was clean and instantaneous and humane. And when it went wrong, when Kemmler suffered and burned and died slowly over the course of 8 terrible minutes, Edison did not reconsider. He did not apologize. He simply noted that the execution had proven his point about the deadliness of alternating current. That is who he was. That is what the War of Currents revealed about him. Not that he was a monster, because monsters are simple and Edison was not simple. Not that he was a villain, because villains know they are villains, and Edison believed, sincerely believed, that he was doing the right thing, protecting the public from a dangerous technology, advancing the cause of safety and progress. He believed it even as he killed dogs in front of audiences. He believed it even as he advocated for a method of execution that would turn human beings into burned and twitching objects. He believed it even as his company filmed an elephant dying and sold the footage to theatres. This is perhaps the most disturbing thing about the story. It is easy to condemn cruelty when it comes from malice, when the person inflicting pain knows they are doing wrong and does it anyway. But Edison's cruelty came from conviction. It came from a belief that the ends justified the means, that the animals he killed were acceptable losses in a war that mattered, that the suffering he caused was a necessary price for the safety he was trying to protect. He was not a sadist. He was an idealist whose ideal required the deaths of dogs and horses and elephants, and eventually human beings strapped into chairs he had helped design. And this is what makes his story relevant beyond its historical moment. Because we still live in a world where idealists cause suffering. We still live in a world where people with the best intentions find themselves justifying terrible means for what they believe are noble ends. We still build our futures on the bodies of those who cannot consent, still tell ourselves that progress requires sacrifice, still look away from the costs of the conveniences we enjoy. The light that illuminates your room as you listen to this came from somewhere. The electricity that powers your devices was generated by some process, transmitted through some system, made possible by decisions that someone, somewhere, made about what was acceptable and what was not. The world that Edison helped create is the world you live in, and the questions that his life raises are questions that have not gone away. What are we willing to do for progress? What suffering are we willing to cause? What cruelties are we willing to accept because they are hidden from us, because they happened far away, because the victims cannot speak? Topsy could not speak. She could not refuse. She could not explain to the 1,500 people watching her die that she did not want to die, that she was afraid, that the chains around her legs were cold and the copper in her sandals was strange, and the men with the cameras were doing something to her that she did not understand. She could only stand there, massive and helpless, while the current was applied and her body stiffened and the smoke rose and the crowd watched. The film captures all of this. It captures the moment before, when she is still alive, still standing, still a creature with a heartbeat and a breath. And it captures the moment after, when she is not. 64 seconds. That is how long it takes to watch Topsy die. That is how long it takes for everything she was to become nothing but an image on a screen, a question that will not go away, a judgment on everyone who watched and everyone who made it possible. And so we come to the question that remains. Not the question of who was right in the war of currents, because that question has been answered by time. Alternating current powers the world. Tesla's system, or rather the system he championed and refined and made practical, runs through the walls of every building you have ever entered. It hums in the transformers on the poles outside your window. It crosses continents on high-voltage lines that would have seemed like science fiction to the men who gathered on Coney Island that January morning. Edison lost. He lost completely, decisively, historically. Within a decade of Topsy's death, his own company had abandoned direct current for most applications. Within 2 decades, alternating current was so universal that the debate itself seemed almost quaint, a relic of a more primitive era when electricity was still new enough to be frightening. The technical question was settled. But the other question, the deeper question, the one that Topsy's death forces us to confront, that question was never settled at all. What does it mean to be remembered? What does it mean to leave a legacy? Edison is remembered as a great inventor, one of the greatest in American history. His name is synonymous with innovation, with brilliance, with the relentless application of intelligence to the problems of the world. Schools are named after him, streets are named after him. The very phrase, "the light bulb went on," carries an echo of his achievement, as if the moment of understanding were itself a kind of illumination that he invented. And in a sense he did. Not the light bulb itself, which had many fathers, but the idea of the light bulb, the cultural image of the inventor as a bringer of light, a defeater of darkness, a person who makes the world better through the force of their genius. Edison created that image as surely as he created the phonograph. He was, among many other things, a genius of self-presentation, a man who understood that in the modern world the story you tell about yourself can become more real than the truth. But there is another Edison, one who rarely appears in the textbooks, one who emerges only when you look closely at the details of his life. This is the Edison who electrocuted dogs to win a contract. This is the Edison who lobbied for the electric chair because it would make his competitors' technology synonymous with death. This is the Edison whose company filmed an elephant being killed and sold the footage as entertainment. This Edison is not a contradiction of the other Edison. He is the same man. The same intelligence that created the phonograph also created the public demonstrations of electrocution. The same business acumen that built an industrial empire also calculated that killing animals on stage would be an effective marketing strategy. The same relentless drive that produced over 1,000 patents also drove the campaign to discredit alternating current by any means necessary. These are not 2 different people. They are one person, one complicated and brilliant and deeply flawed human being who did remarkable things and terrible things, and believed, throughout it all, that he was doing right. This is what makes Edison's story so difficult to hold in the mind. We want our heroes to be heroic and our villains to be villainous. We want the people who change the world for the better to be good people, and we want the people who cause suffering to be bad people. But Edison was both. He lit the world and he killed animals to protect his business interests. He invented the phonograph, which allows us to hear the voices of the dead, and he advocated for the electric chair, which was designed to create death more efficiently. He was a man of enormous gifts and enormous blind spots, enormous generosity and enormous ruthlessness. He was, in other words, human. Not a monster, not a saint, just a person who lived in a particular time and made particular choices and left behind a legacy that includes both the light bulb and Topsy. And perhaps that's the most important thing to understand about this story. Not that Edison was a secret villain, because he was not. Not that we should forget his achievements, because we should not. But that the people who shape our world are people. With all the complexity and contradiction that personhood implies, they make decisions that benefit humanity and decisions that cause suffering. They pursue visions that change everything and compromises that cost more than they can know. They are capable of genius and cruelty, sometimes in the same moment, sometimes in service of the same goal. And we, who live in the world they built, inherit all of it. The light and the darkness, the convenience and the cost, the progress and the bodies on which that progress was built. Topsy is one of those bodies. She was not the first animal to die in the War of Currents, and she was not the last. She was not even the most significant, if significance is measured by the effect of her death on the outcome of the conflict. By January of 1903, the war was already over. Alternating current had already won. Edison had already lost. Topsy's death changed nothing about the electrical infrastructure of the nation. It did not persuade anyone who was not already persuaded. It did not shift any contracts or influence any policies. It was, from a strictly practical standpoint, pointless. Just a dying elephant on a cold morning, filmed by men who thought they were making entertainment. But perhaps that pointlessness is itself the point. Because Topsy did not die for a reason. She did not die to advance a cause or settle a dispute or prove a theory. She died because she was available. She died because her owners wanted to be rid of her, and Edison's company wanted footage, and the people of Coney Island wanted a spectacle. She died because killing her was easy, and stopping it would have been hard. She died because the people who could have saved her did not think she was worth saving. And in dying for no reason at all, she illuminates something true about the broader story, something that all the arguments about alternating current and direct current, all the debates about safety and efficiency, all the business maneuvering and technical innovations tend to obscure. The War of Currents was not really about electricity. It was about power. It was about who would control the future and what they would be willing to do to control it. It was about the discovery that in the modern world, with its cameras and newspapers and audiences hungry for sensation, you could turn almost anything into a weapon if you were willing to go far enough. Edison was willing to go far enough. He was willing to kill dogs and horses and elephants. He was willing to help design a method of execution that would brand his competitors' technology with the stigma of death. He was willing to do all of this not because he was evil, but because he wanted to win, and because nothing in his world told him that the lives he was taking were worth more than the victory he was seeking. And this, finally, is what the War of Currents has to teach us. Not a lesson about technology, though there are lessons about technology embedded in the story. Not a lesson about business ethics, though the ethics of the men involved was certainly questionable, but a lesson about the stories we tell ourselves, the justifications we accept, the suffering we choose not to see. Edison told himself a story in which he was the hero, protecting the public from a dangerous technology. That story allowed him to do things that, without the story, would have been obviously wrong. It allowed him to watch dogs die and feel righteous. It allowed him to advocate for the electric chair and believe he was advancing the cause of humanity. It allowed him to stand behind a camera while an elephant was killed and think he was documenting something important. The story was a kind of armor, protecting him from the implications of his own actions, and the story worked. It worked so well that he never had to confront what he had done, never had to reckon with the lives he had taken, never had to ask himself whether the war he was fighting was worth the cost he was imposing on creatures who had no stake in the outcome. We all tell ourselves stories. We tell ourselves that the meat on our plates comes from somewhere humane, that the clothes we wear were not made by children, that the electricity powering our devices does not carry a cost that someone else is paying. We tell ourselves that progress is good, and that the suffering required for progress is unfortunate but necessary. We tell ourselves that we are different from the people who watch Topsy die, that we would never stand in a crowd and watch an elephant be electrocuted, that we would never film it and sell it as entertainment. And perhaps we are right. Perhaps we are better than that. But the electricity that powers the device you're using right now comes from somewhere. The systems that make your life convenient were built by someone and maintained by someone, and have costs that you probably do not see. You are connected, whether you know it or not, to a vast web of suffering and sacrifice that makes the modern world possible. You're implicated, as we all are implicated, in the choices that other people made before you were born, the choices that created the world you inherited. This does not make you a bad person. It does not make Edison a bad person either. Not entirely, not simply. It makes both of you human, which is to say complicated, which is to say capable of great good and great harm, often at the same time, often without recognizing the harm you're doing. The question is not whether you are innocent. No one is innocent. The question is whether you are willing to look at the costs, to see the suffering that makes your life possible, to acknowledge the bodies on which your world is built. The question is whether you are willing to do what Edison never did, which is to ask yourself whether the story you're telling is true. Topsy's body was left on the beach at Coney Island. The copper sandals were removed and probably melted down. The carcass was too large to move easily, so they buried her there on the edge of Luna Park in the sand where she had walked in her chains. There is no marker, there is no memorial. The amusement park that killed her went on operating for years afterward, thrilling crowds with its lights and its rides and its attractions, until eventually it too faded and closed and was forgotten. Coney Island is still there. People still visit in the summer. They ride the Cyclone, the old wooden roller coaster that has been running since 1927. They eat hot dogs at Nathan's, which opened in 1916. They walk along the boardwalk and look out at the ocean. Almost none of them know that somewhere beneath their feet, probably long since scattered and dispersed by a century of construction and erosion, are the remains of an elephant named Topsy, who died on a cold morning in January because her death was easy and her life was not worth saving. The film is still available, you can find it online if you want to. 64 seconds of grainy black and white footage, captured on an Edison kinetograph camera, preserved for over a century in archives and collections and now digitized and uploaded to servers where anyone in the world can watch it. Most people do not watch it. Most people, when they learn that such a film exists, decide that they do not want to see it. This is probably the right decision. There is nothing in the footage that will tell you anything you do not already know. There is no revelation, no secret truth, no deeper understanding to be gained from watching an elephant die. There is only the dying itself, the fact of it, the irrevocable finality of a life ending while men with cameras record it for posterity. But the footage exists. That is what matters. It exists as a record, as evidence, as a document of what human beings were willing to do to an animal, for reasons that seemed good enough at the time. It exists as a reminder that the past is not as distant as we like to believe, that the people who made our world were not so different from us, that the choices they made are choices we might have made if we had been in their place. It exists as a question, posed to everyone who learns of it, a question that has no easy answer. What would you have done? If you had been there on that cold January morning, would you have watched? Would you have protested? Would you have turned away? Would you have done anything at all? Or would you have stood with the 1,500 others, just another face in the crowd, watching something terrible happen and telling yourself that it was not your responsibility, that there was nothing you could do, that someone else was in charge and someone else would bear the blame? We do not know the answer. We cannot know the answer. We were not there. But we are here now, in a world that Topsy's death helped to build, a world powered by the electricity that Edison and Tesla and Westinghouse fought over, a world where animals still suffer and die so that human beings can have what they want. The question that Topsy's death asks is not a question about the past. It is a question about the present. It is a question about you. The lights are still on. They have been on for so long now that we hardly notice them anymore, hardly remember that there was a time when the night was dark and the world was quiet and the only light came from fire. We flip switches and press buttons and the light appears, instant and reliable, asking nothing of us, demanding nothing, just there, always there, a miracle so common that it has stopped being miraculous. We do not think about where it comes from. We do not think about what it cost. We do not think about the dogs and horses and elephants, the prisoners in the electric chair, the countless creatures who suffered and died so that we could have this convenience, this comfort, this taken for granted illumination of our lives. But the light remembers. Somewhere in the hum of the electricity, somewhere in the flicker of the filament, somewhere in the vast and incomprehensible network of wires and transformers and generators that connects your home to every other home in the world, there is a memory of Topsy, a memory of the copper sandals and the chains and the 1,500 people watching, a memory of the smoke rising from her body and the cameras rolling and the men who thought they were doing something that mattered. The light does not judge. It does not condemn or forgive. It simply is, carrying within it all the history of its creation, all the suffering and genius and compromise that made it possible. And so we come to the end, not of the story, because stories like this do not really end, but of this telling of it. Topsy is gone. Edison is gone. Tesla is gone. Westinghouse is gone. The crowds that gathered on Coney Island are gone, and their children and their children's children. The war of currents is over, decided so long ago that it seems almost absurd now. A quarrel from another age about a question that no longer matters. Alternating current 1. The world was lit. The darkness that had covered the earth since the beginning of time was pushed back, not defeated, never defeated, but pushed back, held at bay by the billions of lights that burn every night in every city on the planet. But in the quiet moments, in the late hours when the noise of the day has faded and you lie in the darkness waiting for sleep, sometimes you might think about the cost. Sometimes you might wonder about the things that were done in the name of progress, the lives that were taken, the suffering that was caused. Sometimes you might think about a circus elephant named Topsy, who killed 3 men and was killed in return, not for justice, not for safety, but for a demonstration, a spectacle, a piece of footage that would be sold to theatres and watched by people who wanted to see something die. She did not know why she was dying. She could not have understood the war of currents or the business rivalries or the technical debates about the relative safety of alternating and direct current. She knew only that she was chained and afraid, that the men around her were doing something strange, that the copper things on her feet were cold and heavy, and then she knew nothing at all. 64 seconds. A cloud of smoke. A body falling. And then silence. The silence is still there. It has always been there, underneath the hum of the electricity, underneath the noise of our busy and distracted lives. It is the silence of all the creatures who have died for our convenience, all the lives that were traded for our progress, all the suffering that we choose not to see because seeing it would be too hard. It is the silence that Topsy left behind, the silence that no amount of light can fill. Listen to it, if you can. Just for a moment before you sleep. Listen to the silence, and remember that it was not always silent, that once there was breathing and heartbeat and a creature who was alive. Remember that the world you live in was built on choices that someone made, choices that you might not have made, choices that cost more than anyone counted. Remember Topsy, remember that she was real, remember that she died, and then gently let her go. The lights are on. They will stay on through the night, humming softly, asking nothing of you. And somewhere in the darkness, somewhere in the silence, an elephant who has been dead for more than a century is finally